that is so interesting to understand is this earth and these heavens with this earth are not God's only project. He has an infinitude of a universe out there to work with and create in and enjoy. We are not the only project of God. That's fascinating to keep in mind, isn't it? His continuing goal is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of all men, who are His infinitude of sons and daughters. I say all men, of course it means all men, women, of course. From the perspective of an individual intelligence, the pattern of eternal progression occurs only once. This is it. Therefore, the only way Dr. Beckwith's argument would make any sense mathematically is if all intelligences had left the intelligence phase of eternal progression for the premortal spirit phase at or about the same time altogether. But they haven't. Even if that were true, however, Dr. Beckwith's reasoning would still fall short, for it assumes that the premortal spirit phase has a set finite duration in each spirit. Here's the fascinating aspect about this. Intelligences may wait through an eternity of time for the opportunity to enter into the next phase of their eternal progression when they will be formed in the image of God. The time a specific intelligence waits will be longer for some than for others. As demonstrated, infinite time periods can actually end at different times. They are still infinite because no matter when they end, they still have periods of infinity stretching off into the far distant past. It's irrelevant when each cycle starts or ends. It still has an infinite past and an infinite future. But they're all different, all the way along, strewn throughout infinity. So, there's no indication in the Scriptures, of course, how long the spirit phase of eternal progression lasts either. We don't know. It may well last for an eternity before the mortal phase is instituted to come into being. So, on any day then, in the universe, it is filled with worlds inhabited by beings who are receiving their turn to enjoy mortality. That's the point that Beckwith misunderstands. This has been happening for an infinite amount of time. This finite personal mortality is sandwiched between infinite periods of time of different duration. Mathematically, this arrangement results in a continuum that has and will last for all eternity. These finite periods are all part of God's one eternal round, however. Even though they're finite, there is still part of the great infinite of God. His infinite cyclical patterns that is capable of producing an infinite number of beginnings and endings, one for each specific group of intelligences who are ready for their turn on earth. That's why there can be an infinite past, and yet we have not yet achieved our Godhead, because we're in a mortal cycle different from someone else who has already gone through all the phases and have become like God. Ours is a different time. Even though we have an infinity behind us and an infinity in front of us. No two cycles are the same time. Infinitely, that is perfectly logical and mathematical. The question naturally arises, when did these cycles begin? Scriptures don't tell us when. They may have been occurring throughout all eternity, for all we know. Or there may have been an eternity that passed before they even began. We don't know that either. but it's certainly possible. If the latter were true, the Lord's cycles would have still begun an eternity ago. Remember, an infinite period of time can contain any number of infinite periods. That's the mistake Beckwith made. But it's not the mistake of Mormon theology. It's the mistake of Neoplatonic classical philosophy that the Christians have adapted as their meaning for truth. Any answers to the questions of beginnings must be recognized as speculative. The pattern will never cease repeating itself, so far as we're aware, and it could have been going on for all eternity without all of them reaching their final state by now. Because if you have infinite cycles, all in different stages of their progression, like we are, then there still may be an infinite amount of beings who have not yet reached Godhead, and an infinite amount of beings who already have. You can have it both ways with infinity. You can't with Beckwith's classical theism of the problem of achieving omniscience by eternal progression. Here Beckwith misunderstands something else that's very interesting. And he's thinking, of course, through Hellenistic philosophical lenses, and then he claims it's the Mormon theology that's the problem. It's fascinating. He makes a priori assumptions that are fundamental to the analysis without fully examining them, and then he assumes scientific facts that are gross and misconstrued. It's fascinating that here is his objection to eternal progression. Premise number 1. A being of limited knowledge gaining in knowledge entails the increasing of a finite number. Premise number 2. Starting from a finite number, it is impossible to count to infinity. So the premise number 3, the Mormon view of eternal progression entails a being of limited knowledge gaining in knowledge until his knowledge is infinite. Remember, the Mormon universe contains an infinite number of things. So his conclusion, premise number 4, his conclusion of number 1 with premise number 4, therefore the Mormon view cannot be true, because it is impossible, given premises number 1, 2, and 3, it is impossible for eternal progression to entail that a being of limited knowledge gains knowledge until his knowledge is infinite. That is impossible. Therefore, the Mormon doctrine of eternal progression is entailed by the Mormon concept of God. Therefore, the Mormon concept of God is incoherent. That's Beckwith's argument against eternal progression. Now, premise number 2 has already been proven false. It is absolutely quite possible to count to an infinite number, provided one has an infinite period of time in which to do so. According to Dr. Beckwith's understanding of Mormonism, all intelligences have already existed an infinite period of time. That's the Mormon doctrine. And therefore they could have easily counted to infinity. In fact, according to the arithmetic of infinity, an eternal being could have counted to infinity an infinite number of times by now, right now. So, the principal error of Beckwith in his argument lies in premises number 1 and 3. His basic conclusion is that if a man doesn't have it already, he can never acquire omniscience. He has to be born omniscient or he'll never become omniscient. His first error is arrived at that conclusion is a false assumption. That assumption is found in the statement that man is a being of limited knowledge. While this is true during our mortality, the real assumption that classical theists make is that man is limited in a more profound sense than his current level of knowledge.